Hello, welcome to a new edition of Türkiye Talks. Today we are going to look at Turkish-US relations and also US foreign policy in general. Today, Jeff Mankoff from National Defense University is joining us. Jeff, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's a pleasure to host you here with Kadir today. Let me start with a general question to frame our discussion, actually. Do you think that the U.S. foreign policy has different priorities when you compare it to 10, 20 years ago? Are there any shifting priorities in the U.S. foreign policy recently that would make an impact on Turkish-U.S. relations and Turkey's regional issues as well?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. Let me just start off by saying that my views represent my own opinions and don't reflect those of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or National Defense University. With that said, let me take your question. I do think there's been a shift in the priorities that the U.S. has pursued internationally over the past 10 years. And we can see a couple of areas where the shift has been pretty dramatic. I think the biggest one is the shift away from counterterrorism and counterinsurgency as the driving force behind U.S. foreign policy, and a renewed focus on what we at one point called great power competition, then we called strategic competition. We may have a different term for it now, but effectively the relationship between the U.S. and other major powers, primarily China and to a slightly lesser degree Russia. And that shift has coincided with the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan, the pullback from Syria, and involvement in the Middle East more broadly, and in the so-called pivot to Asia, which has been going on in some form or another for about 10 years now, but has really developed more substance in the last couple of years, both on the security and the economic fronts.
Right. Does that mean that, when U.S. is trying to, have more, let's say, influence in the East Asia or in the Indo-Pacific region, of course, U.S. is spending more time, energy, and also finance. All the resources now are being spent to be much more strongly present in that area. Does it mean that, U.S. relations with its old allies is weakening or is at risk?
Well, I think that depends how the pivot to Asia is conducted. This is still a process that's underway. I know the Biden administration has made a lot of effort to reassure allies that the pivot towards Asia doesn't imply a pivot away from other parts of the world where the U.S. Has traditionally been engaged, or from global engagement more broadly. And this applies both to U.S. allies in Europe and also to the greater Middle East. That said, I think especially in the greater Middle East, there's been a growing recognition that the level of commitment that the U.S. has devoted to the region, at least since September 11th, 2001, has been incommensurate with the region's significance for U.S. interests. And the result, there's a sort of rebalancing of the portfolio of American assets that's underway. And I think part of that means that regional players, both in Europe and the Middle East, will have more opportunity, but also more responsibility for managing some of the things that up until now they've expected the United States to take the lead on.
Jeff, you are working on Russia. I mean, you have written and you talked about Russian affairs. And now I just would like to bring that issue on the table. Later on, we can look at some other issues. Russia is more present in the Middle East today because, as you said, there is a shifting priority of the U.S. How would you assess that? Because Russia is traditionally a rival to the U.S. interests in the region.
Yeah. So I think it's worth keeping in mind that the Soviet Union was an important player in the Middle East, and that it built pretty deep political, economic, and security relationships with several countries across the region, from Algeria in the west to Syria in the east. And some of those relationships were broken or sundered with the collapse of the Soviet Union, as the new Russian Federation didn't have the same capabilities and it didn't have the same interests. but many of the ties that were built up during the Soviet era, whether that was defense industrial cooperation, whether that was arms sales, whether that was political ties between elites, remained in place. And I think what you saw happen is as Russia's relationship with the Western states, the United States and its NATO allies got worse, and prospects for Russia's integration with Western structures diminished in the years leading up to, and then certainly after 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia executed its own kind of pivot away from the West. And if the priority that Russian leadership was pursuing for most of the post-Cold War era up to that point was figuring out some kind of modus vivendi with the West. After 2014, the conflict in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, the position of sanctions, I think there was a realization in Moscow that period had ended, that the idea of convergence with and integration with the West wasn't possible under current circumstances. And so instead, Russia was going to adopt an increasingly global profile. It was going to seek to position itself as an independent player in an increasingly multipolar international environment. And in doing that, the Middle East was one of the main areas that Russia focused on, in part because of the existence of these ties dating back to the Soviet era, and which, by the way, the Russians felt the U.S. had ignored and had actually done going to invade Iraq, which was one of these countries that had, back in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, close ties with Moscow. And so Russia was very much opposed to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. It was very wary of the U.S. Western intervention in Syria, in Libya, in 2010, 2011, I guess 2011. And it was very much opposed to the idea of the West going in and using force in Syria. And when the United States ultimately decided, when President Obama decided in 2015 that the U.S. was not going to use force in Syria, I think Russia perceived it as an opportunity to go in on its own in a somewhat limited way in order to prop up the Assad government, in order to announce to the wider region that Russia was back in the Middle East, and to position itself as a regional power broker in a way that was independent from this idea of trying to build some kind of integrated relationship with the West, which had really been the lodestar that was guiding strategic thinking in the United States, and I think to some extent in Russia as well, up until that point.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is a very good introduction. Kadir, would you like to pick up any of the issues that Jeff raised? Or if you don't have any, I'll just continue.
Well, I just wanted to comment that, the U.S., let's call it rebalancing, or at least trying to rebalance to Asia, does not mean U.S. is pulling out of the region as is commonly understood. I think the U.S. interests continue in the region. A lot of allies in the region do care about what the U.S. policy is, and it has an impact. I don't think the U.S. is going anywhere anytime soon. But that kind of shifting of resources and refocusing to Asia is largely driven by China's increasing economic power and, in recent years, military power under Xi Jinping, which is a bit more aggressive policies in the South China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. But in some ways, we've seen also that, the China threat, quote unquote, may not be that formidable. The US still has a lot of resources to at least encircle or contain some of the Chinese actions, and shifting of some of the sort of supply lines away from China is putting China in a difficult position. They have many internal problems as well. So I don't feel the panic, let's say, as much as we used to feel under the Trump administration. And Trump administration took a very harsh line on China, and it implemented policies that basically attacked China's economic power wherever it could. But it wasn't necessarily systematic, and it was more punishment oriented, let's say. Under Biden, though, Biden is trying to, bring together the European allies, create a common front, but it's finding it very difficult because all these countries have really, complex relationships with China as well as with Russia, and that includes Turkey as well. So I think the rebalancing of the priorities, U.S. priorities, away from the Middle East to Asia should not be maybe exaggerated and should be sort of understood in its proper context. And the competition in the Middle East between these great powers, I feel like, will continue. And then, that has serious implications for countries like Turkey.
Right. I think here I'd like to raise one issue. When you look that issue from US, I think you have more, let's say, optimistic view. You are not panicking, as you said. There's no panic. But if you look at from the European side, I think there is a lot of concern because they are started talking about, for example, European army, if that is possible. As Jeff said, Middle Eastern countries and Europeans should take more responsibility to run their own affairs. How that will be played into the relations between Europeans and the U.S. administration, Jeff?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big question, and I think it's one that we're still waiting for an answer on. I think there's a certain tension in the way that the U.S. Views this issue, because on the one hand, the position has long been that we want the Europeans to spend more on defense, especially during the Trump administration. There was a lot of emphasis on this 2% GDP defense spending target that NATO members are, in theory, committed to. We have looked to the Europeans to take the lead in dealing with a number of big security issues in Europe, and that includes on some level the conflict in Ukraine, where the Normandy format, which is the main negotiating framework, is being run by the French and the Germans. At the same time, when European leaders talk about strategic autonomy, and this has been primarily something that President Macron in France has emphasized, the US gets a little bit nervous because when Europeans start talking about strategic autonomy, then some of the concerns that you mentioned start to come into play. European views of Russia, European views of China, European views of a lot of things are not 100% aligned with those of the United States, which makes sense given the different historic and geographic and economic considerations that prevail. And if the European countries are going to do more, are going to be in more of a leadership role, then those nuances and those preferences are going to have to be taken into consideration. Now, I think that there's still a long way to go before we're talking about something like an independent European military capability. There are individual countries in Europe, including France, including the United Kingdom, including Italy, including, of course, Turkey, that have significant military capabilities. But in terms of a sort of pooled or EU army or military capability, there's still enough mismatch of resources. There's still too much tension between the different players. There's still too much disagreement about whether that's even a good idea, I think, for it to become a reality anytime in the near future. The other thing I'll say in this context is, of course, one of the longest serving, I think maybe the longest serving leader in Europe right now, Chancellor Angela Merkel in Germany, is stepping down. And with Germany entering a period where it's going to be a little bit more politically unmoored as there are negotiations on forming a new coalition, and you're probably going to have a government that's led by the Social Democrats. I think in France, this is seen as an opportunity to take the lead within Europe and to advance priorities that have been important to France, but not as important to Germany. things like, this idea of European strategic autonomy or a separate European military capability. So there's an intra-European element to this too. But I still think that given concern in a number of the other European countries and just the difficulty of getting all of Europe on one page, there's still a long way to go before that becomes a reality, if it ever does.
Right. I think now we can move on to Turkish-US relations smoothly, let's say. But I'll just bring Russia into the picture because of your expertise on Russian affairs, Jeff. As you have said, in 2014, things have changed in Syria, and Russia became a game changer at the expense of US influence in the region. Of course, US is there still. I mean, there are some proxies. But overall, what is your impression of Russian presence in the region, especially in Syria, which actually brings Turkey and Russia closer because Russia is one of the main players over there. Secondly, Iran has also, wider impact in the region because the US is not there. How would you assess this situation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think Russia's expanded its political and to some degree military footprint in the Middle East fairly substantially since 2014. 2015. Of course, Syria is the clearest example and the only place where Russia is involved in regular military combat. At the same time, there are Russian proxies and Russian private military contractors involved in a number of other places around the region, notably in Libya, among others. But Russia's also positioned itself as an alternative patron for a number of governments that are seeking to hedge, particularly against the United States. So in places like Egypt, where I think there's still a lot of resentment within the current military government about the way that the United States encouraged the Mubarak government, or encouraged President Mubarak to step down at the height of the Arab Spring. And I think Russia has come in part by pointing to what it's been doing in Syria, to make the case to the Egyptians that, unlike the Americans, we stand by our partners and allies. We can provide you with weapons. We can provide you with various other kinds of support. We can provide you with private military contractors. We can do these various things, and you don't have to solely rely on the United States. Now, of course, a country like Egypt isn't going to undertake the term used in Turkey, an axis shift away from the United States and towards Russia. The way that Egypt pivoted in the other direction in the 1970s. But what I do think you're seeing is that countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia to some degree, Turkey as well, are using the fact of Russia's larger presence in the region as a way to enhance their own strategic autonomy, as a way to, in effect, have the capability to say no at sometimes to the United States. And that creates a more dynamic, it creates a more fluid geopolitical environment across the Middle East. And it's one that I think Russia is eager to encourage. Certainly it enhances Russia's own value, it enhances its own leverage, and it opens up new markets, especially for the Russian defense industry, since arms and military technology are one of the main Russian exports, particularly in this region.
I think you have mentioned one thing, that some of the countries in the region are looking at Russia because Russia is coming and they're saying we are not going to leave you on your own like US has done in Libya. And now there is a recent issue that happened in Afghanistan. Again, after 20 years of being present in the country, US has left. Kadir, let me turn to you. How that is justified in the US? I mean, because after 20 years of presence, again, this country is left on its own. As the people of Afghanistan were looking at US as a partner, etc. And who will fill the gap? Which country will move in? Because as Jeff said, in Syria, we have seen that Russia has moved in. What will be the case in Russia, and how it would impact the relations of US and its partners?
I'm not sure if anybody is really excited or interested in entering Afghanistan in this at this time, except maybe China increasing some of its economic influence and political influence there with small investments, because the country is really on the brink of humanitarian disasters. It needs help, foreign aid. And as you know, because of the Taliban government, many Western countries, including the US, are not directly helping the government. So the situation is there, dire, and it's getting worse. Humanitarian organizations are calling for aid to be poured in. Winter is approaching, etc. So, but strategically, the U.S. pullout has, of course, a long story. But if you can summarize it, if you can reduce it to one thing, that would be the realization, acceptance on the part of the American policymakers that they cannot rebuild nations. They cannot export democracy. They can't rebuild nations. They can't change regimes and implement democracy, etc. So I think against that backdrop, the Biden administration did not want to stay any longer in Afghanistan, also because, the American public is very wary of these these efforts to be deploying military resources and spending billions of dollars trying to rebuild these countries. Of course, the original sin of invasions are a different discussion as well. But when that happens, the problem for the U.S. is, when the next crisis occurs, next conflict occurs somewhere around the globe, it will be, very difficult to convince other nations to sort of assemble a coalition and try to perhaps do anything militarily. It's going to have to remain at the diplomatic level, political level, humanitarian level, and that might encourage some bad actors in the future. We don't know that, but strategically, Afghanistan is now moving towards, I don't want to use too many harsh words, but a void almost. We don't know what's going to happen there. I don't think Russia, Jeff would know better, but Russia has a bad history there. I don't think they're interested in moving in there anytime soon. So from the U.S. policy making perspective, Afghanistan is not really, at least for Biden, I guess, Afghanistan is not somehow part of that new Asia policy, or they don't feel that it has serious repercussions or implications for the U.S. Asia policy. And we may have to just wait and see if that's actually correct, because, China is doing a lot in Central Asia, and I don't know how they're looking at Afghanistan specifically. But if you want to somehow restrict China's, influence and power in the region, you have to look at it holistically. And I think right now the U.S. view is much more focused on trade routes and supply chain routes that come from China and go to Europe and go to the U.S. And they're interested in, securing those lines and showing more U.S. presence there, etc. And that will have implications for Afghanistan. Yeah, I guess that's what I can say about that.
Well, thank you, Kadir. Jeff, would you like to comment on this issue, or I can move on to a different topic now?
Sure, I'll say a few things. I think the Russians learned their lesson about Afghanistan, fighting for a decade there, in what ended up being a very feudal conflict that played no small role in sapping the legitimacy of the Soviet system and helping precipitate the crisis that brought it down. So I think the likelihood of Russia going back into Afghanistan militarily is extremely low. That said, of course, the Russians want to have influence there, and they have maintained diplomatic relations with the Taliban for several years now, and are trying to position themselves as an interlocutor between the Taliban and the outside world. So the Russian embassy is one of the small handful that continued to operate in Kabul after the city fell to the Taliban. And while Russia hasn't officially recognized the Taliban government, they have diplomats on the ground there, and they have pretty regular meetings with members of the Taliban in the Afghan government, and are trying to use that connection as a way to influence where that country goes in the future. Whether they'll be successful or not, of course, is an entirely different question. I think Kadir raised an interesting point too, about how the United States looks at all of this. Of course, the withdrawal from Afghanistan was justified in part on the idea that the U.S. needed to move away from this phase of counterinsurgency and nation building in order to focus more on great power competition, above all with China. But Kadir is right that Afghanistan is on China's periphery, and there is a growing Chinese presence there. I think historically, our perception of Asia has been maritime. U.S. engagement with Asia has largely come in the maritime domain. So we used to talk about the Asia Pacific. Since the Trump administration, we've talked about the Indo-Pacific, which is also the term that the Biden administration uses. And I think that framing of it emphasizes that the things that we care about are those things that happen along the coastlines. We care about the lines of communication. We care about the trade routes. We care about the potential challenge that China poses to U.S. treaty allies in Northeast and Southeast Asia, like South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, and others, not to mention Taiwan. At the same time, of course, China is a land power. And part of the thinking behind the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been a central piece of Chinese foreign policy under Xi Jinping, has been to re-anchor China as a driver of regional integration on the Eurasian landmass through infrastructure investment, through people-to-people contacts, through political engagement, and the like. So far, the success has been kind of a mixed bag. But nevertheless, China remains extraordinarily ambitious in terms of the infrastructure projects and the political relationships that it's seeking to develop within and across the entire Eurasian landmass. And this is an area where historically the United States has had comparatively limited interests and has struggled to establish a longstanding toehold. So, you know, in places like Central Asia, in places like Afghanistan, in the Caucasus, in some of the inland parts of the Middle East and West Asia, the U.S. has a much smaller footprint, is less influential than the big regional powers like China, like Russia, in some places like Iran. And that's just a fact of history and geography that I think the U.S. is going to struggle to overcome.
Right now, let me again come back to one of the main issues, that is Turkish-U.S. relations. You know, these countries are all allies in NATO as well, and they have been described as strategic partners in the past. But now we have got a number of spoilers, I think. One of the spoilers is the U.S. support to PKK-related or PKK's offshoot, PYD and YPG. And from the Turkish perspective, actually, this is seen as Turkish public is having a lot of difficulty in understanding why there's such a support, because PKK is recognized as a terrorist organization. Still, U.S. is supporting PYD and YPG. This is not seen in the spirit of cooperation or coordination, etc. And also, given the fact that now ISIS threat is much less, almost disappeared, maybe. How would you describe U.S. mood, actually, given the fact that Turkey is being hurt and also pushed a little bit more and more away from U.S. partnership?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a topic where I'm probably not the best person to ask and say a few sort of basic things. which is that I think the decision to partner with the YPG-PYD was largely driven by tactical considerations about developing a military capability to fight ISIS in northern Syria circa 2014-2015. Once that tactical decision had been made, it underpinned the development of personal and institutional relationships that sort of enhanced the prominence of the YPG-PYD in Washington, and made it harder to sort of pivot away from that decision, even though Turkey had been making clear from the very beginning that it saw U.S. engagement with these groups as being a threat to its fundamental interests, and really kind of a red line. There has been some, especially during the Trump administration, effort on the part of the U.S. to pull away from these groups. But nevertheless, the relationships remain, some of the concerns remain. That said, I think as the U.S. pulls back from the region, not withdraws, but pulls back from the region, it's going to be harder to sustain that relationship. And I think there's going to be more pressure on the YPG-PYD to come to some kind of an accommodation with the regional players that will allow it to continue to exist. Whether that's a message that the U.S. is actively communicating to its Kurdish interlocutors in the region, I'm not sure, but I think it's a message that they probably should be communicating.
Right. Then on that front, actually, on this very specific issue, do you think that there could be any sort of bridging the gap between Turkey and the U.S., or it'll be there for some time to come?
Well, on this particular issue, or more generally?
No, on this particular issue.
I think maybe to some. I think the U.S. started off with a tactical engagement with these groups that over time took on a larger significance and then made it harder to move away from. I think there's gradually been a recognition of the harm that relationship was doing to the relationship between the U.S. and Turkey, and particularly with the threat from ISIS in northern Syria significantly reduced, there's less incentive to maintain that relationship. At the same time, I think it's difficult for a variety of institutional and personal reasons for the U.S. to completely walk away from groups and individuals that it has been working closely with for the last 6-7 years now. So I think this is going to continue to be a challenging issue in the U.S.-Turkey bilateral space. But I also think that as the U.S. kind of reduces its focus, reduces its need to partner with these organizations, that may open up some opportunity to bridge the gap between Washington and Ankara.
Kadir, would you like to pick up any of the issues?
Sure. Talip Hocam, I think what you're trying to get at is U.S. shifting priorities. What does it mean for northern Syria, if I understand it correctly? And I think it definitely has those both dynamics I talked about Afghanistan, that they are valid for northern Syria as well. Of course, very different environment, very different geopolitical space, but the fact that American public opinion doesn't want involvement in militarily in other countries, and then it also doesn't think that it can fix things. Those have a bearing on any U.S. administration, especially this one, Biden administration. And there is just not a lot of debate in the U.S. about this because the U.S. presence there is very limited. And like Jeff said, it started off tactically, and then Obama administration reassured Turkey that it was very temporary. It was going to be just tactical. It wasn't going to evolve into a strategic relationship. And it is hard to define it as a strategic relationship at this point, but it now has its own internal logic in some ways, that now that relationship has been built. And if you remember when Trump wanted to pull out of Syria, there was a huge reaction by Congress and the media that, you know, we were abandoning our Kurdish allies. That's how it was presented in the US. And there was a very big backlash against Trump. So with that background, I don't think Biden is going to pack up and leave anytime soon. But if the support evolves into a more strategic level, and if the support increases, and then Turkish reaction will be even harsher. Turkey, I think, has been somewhat reassuring itself because it has conducted several military operations in northern Syria. It is holding territory, it's providing security. So there's no PKK, you know, along the border exactly. So those are reassuring things for Turkey, but they are extremely worried about US support for YPG because it doesn't just give them, you know, space to operate, military strength, training, etc., but also legitimacy in the eyes of the West. So that it continues to be a big problem. And when US wants to shift its priorities elsewhere, it remains an open question what it's going to do in the region. Like we said, US won't pack up and leave the Middle East. I don't believe that's going to happen. But what it wants to do in the Middle East will have to be clarified. And then within that framework, what will happen to this, you know, relationship with the YPG? Of course, there is one more thing that US worries that if it pulls its support from the YPG, then these guys will only go to Iran and Russia, which is a correct thing. But, you know, YPG, PKK never, they always had relations with Russia and Iran. It's nothing new. And they play that game to legitimize themselves by presenting themselves as the best sort of fighters against ISIS. But yeah, the US policy is not clear on this, and it needs to be clarified when US needs to work with Turkey on a dozen really important strategic issues around the world and in the region.
Okay, I think now we are coming to the end of our program, but my last question is to Jeff, because of his expertise. Again, I'll bring Russia into the discussion, but in the Syrian context, because there is a critique of Turkish, I think, let's say, relations with the Russians in the U.S. Policy makers, in the U.S. academia, in the U.S. Think tank world, because Russia is U.S. rival and not member of the NATO, and sometimes I think in the U.S. Turkey's relations with Russia is not understood well as far as Turks are concerned, because in Syria, Turkey has to deal with a number of actors, and Russia is one of them. And if US is not going to commit itself in the Syrian affairs to find at least some sort of political solution, what will be the future of that sort of complex relation between US and Turkey on the one hand, and also Turkey and Russia on the other hand? Because, as I said, this is something that is not very welcomed by the US, Jeff.
Yeah. So again, I'll come back to something that I said a little bit earlier, which is that I think for Turkey, Russia's interjection into this region represents both a threat and an opportunity. It represents a threat, obviously, in the sense that Russia's projecting military power in regions that are fundamental to Turkey's security, and usually doing so in ways that are not coincident with Turkey's own interests. At the same time, I think because Russia is more active in this region, it provides a bit of a hedge. And I think as the relationship between Turkey and the United States in particular has become more complicated for a variety of reasons, and I think the U.S. response to the coup attempt in 2016 is part of this. That having Russia as a potential alternative pole allows Turkey to have a little bit more strategic autonomy. It allows it to try to engage the U.S. from a kind of position of strength. The problem comes, I think, one, when that gets overdone, and two, from the U.S. that is still extremely sensitive about the nature of the evolving Russo-Turkish relationship. And I think the S-400 is probably a good example of this. For Turkey, it's there are a variety of reasons for the interest in that system. Certainly, it gives Turkey an autonomous capability and allows it to operate a system that is not sort of dependent on NATO or the United States for acquiring. At the same time, I think it has evolved into creating all of these other security concerns in the United States and other NATO partners around the security of the F-35 program, which ultimately led to Turkey's being excluded from it. And so this, may be one of those instances where, this effort to try and use the Russia relationship as a way of enhancing Turkey's strategic autonomy may have gone too far in the sense that it, created this backlash, which is now, I think, sort of alongside the PKK, YPG, PYD issue become, kind of a central problem in the relationship. If the YPG, PYD issue is kind of central for Turkey, I think the S-400 has become just about that central for the United States right now. And that's kind of on top of the various other irritants that have propped up in the relationship. And so I think if we're going to get back to a more transparent and more trusting bilateral relationship between Washington and Ankara, I think these are a couple of issues that are going to have to be more effectively managed.
Well, thank you. We come to the end of Türkiye Talks new edition. Hopefully, we will see our audience at a later time. Jeff, thank you very much for joining us today. It was a pleasure having you here on this program with Kadir Üstün, and I would like to say goodbye to everyone. Take care of yourself. Have a nice time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Talip.